Hi everyone, I'm with Nicholas. How are you, Nicholas?
Hi Mark, how are you? Good to be with you.
Yeah, good to be with you too. So let's walk around here a little bit. We are on the IFC rooftop. Ooh. In central Hong Kong. We're gonna sit down somewhere for a drink, is better. But yeah, Nicholas, how's everything? How long have you been in Hong Kong?
I've been in Hong Kong just over a decade now, so it was late August of 2023 last year that I marked 10 years in Hong Kong. So I made the move over August 2013. I was initially at University of Hong Kong for 1 year. I did the PCLL course, which is the law certification you need to be able to start working as a lawyer in Hong Kong, and then I've been practicing law in Hong Kong ever since then. So I started, August 2014. So I suppose it's almost 10 years since that milestone as well. So in that time, I've seen, life has gone by very quickly in Hong Kong over that decade.
Yeah, time flies here.
I know you've been in Hong Kong for a similar amount of time as well.
It's my 12th year, so almost 12 years. Good. And you work around here? You just arrived here from your office?
Yeah. My office is nearby in Central, so I had a meeting that finished up, and I just came over here to the IFC to come and meet you and have a chat.
Nice. Okay. Let's have a drink. Maybe there's a bar here or here, and let's talk about everything. You're gonna tell us our interesting history here.
Sure.
Okay, we're now sitting down here with a nice view.
Yeah, mesmerizing, isn't it, in the background?
Yeah.
We've got the skyline of Kowloon. We're sitting here on top of the IFC podium.
Happy Spring is written. Yeah.
Oh, it even says that on the ICC. Happy Spring.
Yeah, that's the Hong Kong life. We have some music nearby, but I think you can hear us. Okay, so Nicholas, thanks for getting up with me. And
thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, so I'd like to know where you're from, why you came to Hong Kong, what you're doing here, what's in your mind. Tell us everything about how you came here and decided to live in Hong Kong.
Sure. Well, I'm from Australia. I was born in Sydney. Around the age of 8, I moved to a small town called Traralgon in country Victoria. It's about 2 hours drive to the east of Melbourne. And that's where I grew up. That's where my formative childhood years were, and then boarding school in Melbourne, university, and then after university it was where almost straight away I moved over to Hong Kong. And there was a couple of reasons for that. One was just in terms of opportunities. Towards the end of university I went and did internships and clerkships with a number of different organizations, and one of the places I came to was Hong Kong, and I really liked it here. It was a dynamic, vibrant, energetic place. It was one of the great crossroads of the world. Very easy to meet people coming together to do all sorts of interesting things, commercially, socially, and I thought I wanted to be part of that, and it would be great to move over. So I went looking for jobs to apply for, and got one to make me an offer to come over. It was one of the UK law firms, their Hong Kong office, that made me an offer. So I accepted that and moved over. I had my first year at the University of Hong Kong, so I did the PCLL course, so I could be eligible to practice law here. That was very good for meeting.
So you passed degree here, you did something here?
Yes, that was a good way of not just being locally qualified, but meeting local people and getting to understand a bit more of how local culture works, how the city thinks, the way things are done here. And so I can say Hong Kong was a very conscious choice because I had the opportunity to stay in Australia. I did a placement in Singapore. I also spent some time in Washington DC. I worked in a senator's office for a couple of months as a researcher.
Senator's office?
Yes.
Wow.
Senator Crapo, the senior senator from Idaho. He was the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee when the Republicans had the majority. Now they're in the minority, so I think he's now the ranking member. So he always had, at that time, he was sort of reasonably senior, but now he's quite senior, so he's gone up in the ranks, which is good to see. And out of all those places, Hong Kong was the one that I really wanted to go to. And it also helped, of course, that it had a very, and still does have a very open, free market mindset. And if you have a choice between working hard in Hong Kong and enjoying the fruits of your labour, so to speak, or being in Australia or any other overtaxed, overregulated welfare state, I thought to myself, do I want to spend the prime productive years of my life being enslaved by somebody else who takes all of my rewards and spends it on lazy people, or do I want to enjoy more of that for myself? And for all those reasons, Hong Kong really added up, and so that's why I moved over, and that's why I've stayed to this day.
Okay, very nice. And what was your link with the Republican senator? How did you end up getting this job?
That's a very interesting question. I think it surprises a lot of people because I think amongst Americans they can be very competitive to get these sorts of internships. And then when I would meet some of these people when I was there, and when I was outside, talking to people in Australia, Hong Kong, they always wonder, how did you as an Australian, end up in that position?
Yes.
And just by chance, there was an ex-advisor on the Democratic side of politics who was very senior. He worked for a lot of very important Democratic congressmen, senators, cabinet secretaries. And just by chance, I think he traveled to Australia and he developed a real love for Australia. And the way he put it was that he wanted to do something, a voluntary initiative of his own, to promote Australia-US relations. And the idea he came up with was a reverse exchange of sorts. His idea was that he would take his political connections in the US on Capitol Hill in the Congress, and he would use those networks to arrange internship opportunities for Australian university students who would come and participate in the program, who would get some valuable, very unique work experience, and hopefully they would use that to improve their understanding of America, to be ambassadors for the US-Australia relationship. And over time, maybe those people would go on to do important, successful things in their careers, wherever they might be, and that would be an asset to Australia-US relations. So I'm really indebted to Eric Federing's initiative in coming up with that program, and he ran that pro bono for about 20 years. He was never paid for it, but he did it in his own free time because he thought that was a valuable thing to do for, I guess you could call it, a form of education or cultural diplomacy, bringing people together, but specifically bringing young Australians to Washington, D.C. to learn more about American culture and specifically America's system of governance. And I was very pleased a few years ago that the Governor-General gave him an award in the Order of Australia to recognise his contributions. So I know that's made a huge difference for a lot of people who participated. If you have that on your CV, it's always something people you ask about when you apply for jobs. It's a good talking point. And I think one or two people on the program have gone on to enter politics on their own. So there was a friend of mine, in Australia. So a friend of mine who was a year ahead of me at university and did the program the year before me, and was actually quite helpful when I asked him for advice on doing the application. He's now in the Australian Senate. I think one of the younger people to ever get elected.
Oh,
but
nice.
he's now a shadow minister for Home Affairs, Senator Patterson. So I think it's been very useful for all of us who participated, especially him as well. So it was a valuable program. I got to see things that I think I'll never get to see again, because when you're there working in the office, you have a security pass, which means you can roam around Capitol Hill, the buildings of Congress and the surrounding office buildings, and go to a lot of places that you can't go to as a member of the public. So one of the things that I learned is that all the office buildings are sort of dotted around the Capitol building. They're all connected by tunnels. There's a private subway that you can ride to get between them all. So when you have that pass, you can go and ride on that. And I have some very grainy selfie footage, because back then I think we all still had like Nokia phones, and camera phones had just come out, but they were very basic. So there's a very grainy selfie of me on that private subway, sitting somewhere on an old phone or my hard drive. I'm not sure exactly where, but I have some really good memories of that.
Okay. So now you're in Hong Kong, happy, and what's your mindset? Are you here for a few more years, and you plan to go back to Australia? You see yourself like for the very long term here? What's your mindset?
Very good question. And I think, as you would know, Mark, the city is replete with people who say that they came for 12 months, or maybe they signed a contract for 2 or 3 years, and then they say, oh, that was like 20 years ago. So it has a way of pulling people in and keeping them here for the long term. And in my own position, I've been here for 10 years. I don't have any immediate plans to go home to Australia or to move anywhere else. I think it's very difficult to replicate the unique attributes of Hong Kong in any other city. So, international city, very good infrastructure, convenient in terms of moving around internally, going to the airport and flying to other places. We have direct flights to almost anywhere. Very good food and beverage, restaurants, a very eclectic, I guess you could say, social scene, because you have people from all around the world who are living here, doing business, enjoying life. And for example, I had lunch today at a Ukrainian restaurant, and I spoke to a friend in Australia afterwards. I don't know if you've been to Ivan the Cossack, but it's very good, on Wyndham Street. And I spoke to a friend in Perth afterwards, and I said, oh, by the way, you probably wouldn't believe this, but I'm in Hong Kong. I just had Ukrainian for lunch, and he couldn't think of any Ukrainian restaurants in Australia. So not a sort of a prominent cuisine that you'd probably think is particularly well known, but we actually have 2 different Ukrainian restaurants. The other one is called Dasha, and I've been there quite a lot. They're both very enjoyable. So it's that cosmopolitan international vibe that's hard to replicate, and of course an environment where it's easy to do business and get things done. It's very rare that you have that. Not to say that Hong Kong's perfect. There are some bureaucratic frustrations we all face, but
not as much as France.
France is another story altogether, but compared to most places,
for me it's very, very smooth.
The bureaucracy, the regulation, the taxation, all the nanny state things regulating all the minutiae of your daily life, or the censorship telling you what you can or cannot say. And that's not just a question of law, but also sort of what corporate HR departments kind of force you to do or force you not to do. And that's so difficult, I think, in France or Australia, the UK, America. And I think we're kind of insulated from that in Asia, especially in Hong Kong. And that's definitely in Hong Kong's favour. So I don't have any plans to go anywhere else. If a good opportunity came up, I wouldn't say no. But I think it would be hard to say goodbye. Because once you've been here for 10 years, and I'm sure you know this too, Mark, you have your own network, you have all these different organizations, connections, you're probably on a few different boards and committees, and if you leave that all behind.
You have to
start again. Yeah. And Hong Kong's a very easy place to come to and start up. It does take a bit of time, but it is very open. But I feel that, if you weren't Australian and you went to Australia, I think Australia would be harder for people to start up in. And I think if I went back, there'd be some challenges. If I went to the UK, if I went to Europe, if I went to America, I think starting up there would not be as easy as the time I had starting in Hong Kong. So that's something to think about as well.
How about Singapore? Because you're talking about Hong Kong, well-connected business and so on. Singapore is a bit similar, people say. Have you been there? Do you know Singapore? And how do you prefer Hong Kong, Singapore? What do you think?
I've traveled to Singapore a lot, both for business and for, just to have a holiday or for leisurely purposes. And Singapore is a great place to visit. You get to the airport, you're out quickly. Everywhere is within sort of a 20-25 minute taxi ride. It is convenient in that sense. But I think it would be a less stimulating place to live in. It's a flat island. It's very well developed. In some ways they do better with green space and spacing out the buildings, but it doesn't have nature in the same way Hong Kong does. A lot of people outside don't know it, but Hong Kong is full of mountains, small islands. You can actually get away from the urban mentality. You can be very isolated if you want to go off somewhere in the bush, in a country park, so to speak. So that's one thing. I think there is more happening in Hong Kong. I think the cultural scene is a little bit better in terms of museums, art. We've got Art Basel happening this weekend, so that scene is a lot better. The other thing about Singapore is it can be a quite rigid place. So for example, you want to move there and you want to stay there. It's unclear how you get permanent residency. Unlike Hong Kong, you stay 7 years, you get it by filling in a form.
It's
time served. Singapore, it's very vague. It's not really based on how long you stay there, although that's a factor. and they'll say either yes or no, but the criteria are sort of all unwritten. It's not clear. So there's a little bit of uncertainty there, and also I find the bureaucracy there efficient but rigid. So by comparison, I feel Hong Kong, it can be very bureaucratic too, but I think there's a little bit more room for negotiation. At the end of the day, people are a little bit more pragmatic in Hong Kong. They want to get things done. You know, I help you, you help me. Whereas Singapore, they will follow the instruction manual to the very last letter, and they will not deviate from any circumstances. So if you fit the cookie cutter for whatever process you're going through, it'll be very efficient. But if there's anything unorthodox, then it gets a little bit more difficult, and they can be very stubborn about that. So, you know, there are trade-offs between the two. I think on balance, if I had a choice, I would prefer to be in Hong Kong. Although at the moment, I think it's fair to say the Singaporean economy is doing better, and you know, if you're looking for jobs, depending on your field, there probably is a more vibrant job market in Singapore right now. And I know that's made a lot of people move down there. But, you know, I think if I had a choice between the two, I would pick Hong Kong. But, you know, if I was asked to go to Singapore, I wouldn't have a problem going. I think I'd still have a good life, you know?
Yeah. And I know in Hong Kong there's a lot of Australians. The community is quite big, right?
Yeah.
What about Singapore? Is it about the same?
Well, in Hong Kong, it's the second biggest overseas Australian community. Just over 100,000 people. The only one that's bigger is the UK. So if you go to London, there are more. So Hong Kong is second. Singapore is probably up there in the top. I assume it's definitely top 5. I think there'd be at least 30, 40,000, no problems. And it is growing, I know.
Okay, well, in the French community, there's also a lot in Hong Kong. And what I see from the French people who are thinking to move to Hong Kong, I see a lot of people ask me when I have a job offer in Hong Kong, a job offer in whatever, New York, for example, they ask me questions. They tell me, hey guys, tell me the truth, how is life in Hong Kong? And actually it looks like from France, Hong Kong has a bad image, or Hong Kong and China. They say this law and this, and after the protest and the COVID and so on. Is it the same in the Australian community or whatever? What can you say about life in Hong Kong when people are worried? They think like they can be worried. Well, how can you make them believe that it's so? How fun is life here?
I think it's always one of those things, you have to come and see it for yourself and make up your own mind. You know, there's that old saying that, you know, if you read the newspaper, you're misinformed. If you don't read it, you're uninformed. So, you know, if you do read the newspapers, you've got to sort of take it with a grain of salt and come and see it yourself. Now, you know, a lot of things have happened in Hong Kong over the last 5 or even 10 years, and there have been some changes, but you know, I think a lot of the basic benefits of being in Hong Kong are still there. You know, if your plan was to come to Hong Kong and start up a political party or join a local political party, then, you know, that's probably, you know, that's a non-starter, I would say.
Is that a good idea?
But I suspect
we're not supposed to do that.
Most people who are moving to Hong Kong from overseas, that's probably not part of their plan. And, you know, maybe, you know, in some ways, you know, the loss of that vibrancy and noise, you know, I think has damaged its reputation, but I think the business opportunities, the infrastructure, the services, it's all still efficient, it's all still ticking over. And what I would say about COVID is, I think the experience in Hong Kong versus in China was very different during COVID. So Hong Kong's lockdown was never anywhere near as severe as China. And I would say actually, coming from Australia, and Australians will probably be surprised to hear this, but Australia was much worse than Hong Kong during COVID. So it was regulated. You know, you could only go to the supermarket maybe once per day or so many times per week, and you had to go to the one that was nearest to your house, and if you went to one farther away, the police could arrest you and fine you. There was a stage where they said you could only leave your house for exercise for like 1 hour a day, and there were cases where, you know, the neighbours would snitch and they'd ring up the police and say, oh, my neighbour went out for a run and that was 2 hours ago, so that's more than their allotted 1 hour. And they would get fined because the neighbours would dob on them. You couldn't visit friends' houses or go and visit your family or, you know, your boyfriend or your girlfriend. So there were a lot more restrictions in Australia, and we never had that in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
You know, I remember having conversations saying, oh, I went to a friend's place to say hello and have something to eat, and the reaction I got was, are you allowed? I said, what do you mean? Of course you are. Not in Australia.
Yeah, true. I think it's we, contrary to most people think, it was very good to be in Hong Kong. It was not easy to travel, get out and get in. That was quarantine and so on, but life staying here was pretty good. Now we just hope that the economy recovers and so on and so on.
I did quarantine twice, but I made sure it was when it was 7 days because I wasn't going to do any longer. That was my limit of tolerance. So I just didn't travel until it got down to 7 days.
But 7 days only. You didn't do the 14 or 20
No, I refused. Too long for me.
Yeah, too much. Okay, good. So yeah, I agree with you about like the settling now in Hong Kong and about the politics and so on. But you know, like I'm interested in politics, in French politics. I know you are involved also in Australian, and you have some experience in the US and so on. Can you tell us more about the politics? What are you doing in politics? What are you interested in?
I've always been interested in politics from a young age. You know, I can think back to primary school where, you know, the teachers were trying to make you read and you had to keep a list of what you were reading each week, and you know, you're meant to write down the names of whatever the material it was, the book and so on. And you know, I wasn't really keen on reading fiction books, but I was keen on reading newspapers or Time magazine or National Geographic, you know, factual non-fiction stuff. And you know, one teacher one year said, well, that's good, you know, because they were having trouble getting boys to read anything, so if a boy is willing to read anything, they thought that was a good thing. The next year I had a teacher who didn't like that and thought, you really need to be reading fictional books, so she tried to force feed me Harry Potter, which I wasn't interested in because I generally wasn't into fiction. I especially wasn't into, you know, silly kids going around pretending to be wizards doing witchcraft. So, you know, probably because of that, I was never very keen on the Harry Potter series, and I have zero interest whatsoever in it. So, you know, going back to when I was sort of 9, 10 years old, I wanted to read about news, current affairs, politics. So that's what I did. And I guess my interest probably grew out of that. And, you know, over time you develop your own moral and philosophical compass, what you believe in. You know, I myself, I would say I'm, you know, a traditionalist conservative. I think respect for tradition is important. I think governments should be modest in what they try to do. They shouldn't tax people too much. They shouldn't regulate too much. They should give people the space to be creative, to live their own version of what they feel is their best life, be the best version of themselves. They shouldn't generally be told what to do. And if you let people do that, I think you'll create a lot more wealth for society. And the more you create wealth, the more you can be generous. The better you can do with your infrastructure, your services. People will generally be more content. They'll be more respectful of the environment. You'll have a cleaner environment. You'll have less crime. So how do you get there? I think having those basic principles, having respect for traditions, because we all come from somewhere, we all have a history, we don't exist in a vacuum, we aren't necessarily better or smarter than our ancestors. We should respect our heritage, we should respect our traditions, and we should cherish the family unit, because that's the best guarantor of people's welfare. It's not the welfare state, it's not politicians being generous with other people's money, it's not big bureaucracies trying to help people with, you know, social workers or nurses or doctors or aged care workers who they might do their best, but they're not going to look after you in the same way that a family member will. They won't look after you like a mum or a dad or a spouse, a husband or a wife or your own children. So that's why you need to encourage people to have stable families. And when you get rid of that, I think that's a big problem, particularly in Western countries, is that the family unit has been devalued, it's been diminished, and so when that has fractured, people feel that, well, they demand that the government fills the void. So that means they tax people more, they regulate people more. It becomes a very vicious cycle, because the more you tax people, the harder it is for people to provide for their own families. So I think that's very destructive for society.
But there's a kind of trend in Western society, and especially in Australia, to go against these traditional values of family and so on. A lot of people, they don't want to have kids because they think the world is going crazy, and then because of the climate change and this and that, or because it's so expensive or whatever. So they're happy to just have no kids, travel, they have different values. So did you grow up in this work culture, I would say?
I didn't grow up in the warped future. I think I was actually very lucky to have a very stable family upbringing. That's something you only really recognise as an adult. As a child, you don't really notice these things. But you know, I had a mum and dad at home who were married, who are still married, who raised us well. Dad worked. My mum was a full-time mum. I guess that's a very conventional, traditional upbringing that everybody had probably until about 20 years ago when things started to change dramatically, and I think change for the worse.
What about the Australian government, the politics?
Well, I think one of the problems is the Australian government, like most Western governments, they don't encourage families at all. It's very hostile. So, for example, one of the things that should have been introduced a long time ago is income splitting. So the idea is that you treat a family as a household for taxation purposes. So if one parent works and one parent stays at home, if one parent earns, say, $200,000 a year, they have the top tax rate of 45%. But if both parents have paid jobs and they earn $100,000 each, they pay much less tax, even though their household income is the same. So there's a very strong disincentive against people spending time with their children. All the policies geared towards families, they seem to be about forcing both parents to be in the paid workforce, which means they don't get to spend much time with their children raising them. And realistically, if you want your children to be the best they can be, they need to spend time with their parents. They need someone to cook them home-cooked healthy meals. They need someone to take them to school, to take them to their activities, their sport, their music, their chess, whatever it is they do. They need someone to supervise them doing homework and help them, to take them to friends' places for play dates. So, you know, I remember when I was at primary school, especially in the early years, it was common that the mums would sort of volunteer at the school, and when you would do, you know, reading groups, it quite often would be someone's mum who would sort of coordinate the reading group, even though it was during the school day, and would, you know, you'd have to read to the person. It was probably somebody else's mum, not just the teacher, and that probably doesn't happen so much anymore.
So, well, the family is very important to disconnect from the general values of. But why is Australia so different than I would say Western Eastern Europe? Right? Do you have some background in Europe? You're
that's
from
right.
Hungary, I think.
Yeah, my maternal grandfather was born in Hungary. He fled as a result of the Second World War and came to Australia as a refugee. So, you know, because of that, you know, I'm partially Hungarian too. You know, entitled to Hungarian citizenship. I visited twice. I've gone to see the village and the house where he was born and had his, you know, formative years until they fled because of the war. Unfortunately, he passed away before I was born, so I never met him. But his older brother, I met in Australia as a very young child. I have very vague memories of meeting him, not very clear, but I did meet him. And the younger brother, who only passed away this time last year, unfortunately, Uncle Yenna, he lived until probably about 90 or so. I was fortunate to visit him in Hungary in 2016 to go and see his holiday house by Lake Balaton, which is not too far from, you know, the village the family all came from. And so I was able to see that kind of rural Hungarian lifestyle and, you know, see some of the family photo albums that he kept in the house, and their photos going back a few generations. And it was actually because of him I was able to find out how to claim the citizenship and the passport, because he had some documents that were helpful that you send in to prove, you know, your link and your ancestry. So, you know, if it wasn't for him, you know, I never would have been able to prove that to a legal standard. And just by chance, I found his email address, so I sent him an email saying I was researching the family tree, and I asked him what he could tell me, and he sent some documents, and because of that I had some names and some dates, and so I could write to different local archives requesting more documents following the family tree. So I was able to get documents going back to sort of 1820 something or thereabouts, and that's about as far as you can go with civil district records, because before that they didn't really have civil records. The records that would exist would all be in church archives, because it would be churches who record births, marriages, funerals. So to go any farther, you'd need to find, I guess, which church, you know, in the place they lived and then it depends on how good their records are. And sometimes these things get lost or misplaced, or because there were a lot of border changes and wars in Austria-Hungary, a lot may have been destroyed as well. So I could go back at least that far.
Okay. And how important was it for you to dig into it and claim your citizenship and so on? Like, not everybody does it. Why was it important for you?
Well, I did it because I have a natural interest in history. So, I guess family tree ancestry is a form of history. Some people are very serious about genealogy, for example. So, I did it out of my own personal curiosity. Being able to claim a citizenship or a passport, that's a secondary benefit. It's a nice thing to have. You go to Europe and you can skip the queue because you go through the EU line. But for me, it was an interesting historical exercise, and it helped add some colour to the things I heard growing up. So, my mother would talk about, her father and, some of the Hungarian relatives she met when she was growing up. She was an only child, so because of that, I didn't have too many close cousins on that side of the family to interact with. So, that part of the family history, it was really based on what she would say, and probably the most direct representation or interaction we had was in what we would eat at home, because what she cooked was influenced by that. So part of what we ate at home was, influenced by Austro-Hungarian cuisine. So things like veal schnitzel, for example, is probably my favourite home-cooked meal, and Mum makes the best veal schnitzels there are, and that's because of that ancestry, that recipe is, in the family, and that's something that she would cook. Paprikash chicken is another one. Goulash. Growing up, we would eat these things. To us, it was normal, and I only really understood, I guess, as I came to adulthood, that most of my friends in Australia probably didn't have that experience. And I kind of noticed when I would get invited to friends' places that there was always a problem, well, not always, but often a problem, that what was on offer for dinner or lunch was not really so exciting. Quite often it's very stodgy, mash and roast, for example, or something like that, which I guess most people would eat because they didn't have those ancestral or cultural influences in their family.
Okay. So now you have the citizenship. Do you plan to make full use of it? Are you going to vote, for example? Are you going to be involved in the political life?
Yeah, well,
Hungary?
One of the quirks is I am able to enroll to vote, so I can vote in the European election coming up in June.
Soon.
I voted in the Hungarian election. It was 2022. There was an election. There was also a referendum on child protection, which is very important. I voted in that, and I will vote in the European election as well. I do follow European politics and Hungarian politics because I'm generally interested in international politics, and being able to exercise the vote in it is just a bonus. And Hungary at the moment, I think, is doing a very good job. It's really one of the shining lights internationally for conservative policy, because they have a very strong long-term conservative government under Fidesz and the Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who's one of the leading conservative world leaders. So CPAC, the American Conservative Conference, they now like going to Budapest a lot. American journalists on the conservative side like going to Hungary and holding it up as an example. And there's a lot of international conservatives that have now moved to Budapest because it's sort of become a centre of the global conservative movement, because they see a government that is reducing tax, that's trying to spend reasonably, and perhaps most importantly is very pro-family and socially conservative. So one of the policies they have that I think is very good is that if a mother has more than 3 children and is married, then she doesn't have to pay income tax for the rest of her life. That's a very strong incentive. There are incentives when based on having more than one child, that the government gives you a grant to help you buy a larger car so you can transport your family.
So how is the natality rate in Hungary now?
So that's made some difference in increasing the birth rate.
It's better than Western Europe now, right?
It's improving. So I mean, like all European countries, it has a problem. I think it's below 2.
Yeah,
you need to get
sure
above 2. But compared to other European countries, it's not the worst, and there's been a gentle uptick in the right direction. So hopefully that continues.
Okay. have you made your choice for the European elections? Is it Viktor Orban's party or is another one? How many conservative parties there in the?
Viktor Orban is the main conservative party. I would say the only real conservative party, actually. I will support him as I did, in the election in 2022 because, I generally agree with their philosophy. I think he's done a good job for Hungary since he got elected in 2010. If you look, the economy has improved tremendously. And even when I visited 2014 and 2016, in that 2 years, I could see a significant amount of development. The GDP has continued to go up. It's become much more sophisticated as an economy. It's been very good at attracting foreign investment. So a lot of German companies are manufacturing there, cars and pharmaceuticals in particular. Audi has a very big factory. They've also been very good at trying to do outreach to Central Asia, to East Asia, exploring for more investment. And most importantly, I think he's been standing up for national sovereignty. He's been resisting this Brussels dictatorship, trying to impose cultural Marxism and centralization of power in Europe at the expense of the sovereign democratic decision-making of the nation states of Europe. And I think we need to have a very strong Fidesz representation in the EU Parliament to stand up against that. It came out in the FT just a few weeks ago that if Orban didn't capitulate on this proposal for some kind of aid package for Ukraine, that they had a plan to basically declare economic war on Hungary. They were going to withhold all these funds that belong to Hungary. They actually had leaked papers saying that they would deliberately try and manipulate the bond markets to mess with the currency and destabilize the economy. Now, it's just extraordinary that the European Union is meant to be a friendly, collaborative,
except if you disagree with
network of equal countries. But actually, they were bullying a small member state. Hungary's only 10 million people. And you had these dictators in Brussels saying, well, if you don't capitulate, we're going to declare economic war, because that's what it is. If you go to war against somebody's currency, if you deliberately want to drive up the interest rate they pay on their bonds, the government's cost of funds, you're deliberately sabotaging the economy of one of your own member states. It's extraordinary. So, I want Fidesz to do very well in these elections because, I think that behaviour from the EU is just dreadful. And I also think, this, debate, in terms of Europe, whether is Europe a cooperative, free trade zone of democracies cooperating together, or is it a federation where the EU and Brussels is going to take over and run everything and just dictate to what the member states what they can and can't do? I think that's a problem. I think that's just a reincarnation of the Soviet Union. That is, a Marxist dictatorship, really, and it's an abuse of the word democracy.
A lot of people call this is the EU SSR.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I'm very strongly against that. So, Hungary is one of the countries that's trying to fight back. Poland was too, although they unfortunately had a change of government a couple of months ago. So I think that really leaves sort of Hungary and Slovakia as two of the main countries who are resisting on that front. The other area where there's a problem too is in terms of spending. How many European countries are fiscally responsible? It's really just what you would call the V4. So Slovakia, Hungary, the Czechs, the Poles. Although the Poles are questionable because Donald Tusk is not good news for Poland. The Baltic states are very responsible. They're small, but they're very responsible, and I have a lot of respect for them. And I visited both Latvia and Estonia, and they really impressed me in terms of what they've achieved in a short period of time.
I have to say it's the member states which have the least immigration from people who don't work most of the time. So there's a lot of spending in other countries, like for welfare.
You're right. And as a tourist, I chose to go to Eastern Europe after university out of curiosity because I thought the stereotypical thing to do was, go to Paris, go to Berlin, go to Spain, Italy. I thought, that's what everybody else is doing.
Have fun, discover the big capitals.
Yeah, and when I was looking to book tickets, because I didn't have much money, but I wanted to travel in style, I decided I would use air miles. And I had a choice. Qatar, I could get a ticket with miles in business. I could go to Berlin. I could go to Warsaw. I knew lots of people who'd been to Berlin. I knew nobody who'd been to Warsaw. And when I asked around, nobody knew anything. And their reaction was also, well, why on earth would you go there? Which to me was an encouragement. I thought, oh, if nobody I know has gone there, I'll go and explore. More interesting. It'll be more of an adventure. So I went. And that's when I discovered Eastern Europe. I really saw that it was a place on the up because I felt people were very open, people were very friendly, streets were clean, not too much welfare, not flooded with, illegal immigration. It's very safe to walk around. You walk around Warsaw or Budapest late at night, you're not worried about pickpockets, you're not worried about being mugged.
I would say, what is the secret of Eastern Europe? Why do they have less illegal immigration?
Well, they have a very different attitude. They don't want it. So Hungary actually enforces the border. So before Trump talked about building a wall, Viktor Orban built a wall, mostly along the border with Serbia, because Serbia's not in the EU, and a lot of them were just walking across the border and then, walking or taking trains elsewhere in Europe where there's more welfare, usually Germany, Sweden, those sorts of places were the end destinations. And it's quite funny. So first of all, Hungary decided we're going to enforce the border. And the EU told them off for enforcing the border? Like, it's just absurd. Like, there's a border, enforce it. It's just common sense. And, one of the other reasons that illegals don't like staying in Hungary is A, not much welfare, B, they all say, well, Hungarian's a really difficult language, I can't possibly learn it, I'll go somewhere where I can get by with English, or English Swedish and German is easier, and they're more sort of tolerant of people not learning the local language, whereas I don't think Hungarians will really accept that very much. If you're there and you want to, bludge off them and you don't speak the language, they're not going to put up with that. But I think you ask a broader question, why is the culture in Eastern Europe different? Why is it that they want to enforce their borders, they don't want to be flooded by illegal immigration, they don't accept being over-regulated, they don't want to be taxed, they value the family unit and their traditions. I think it's because they hit rock bottom during the Cold War. They suffered under Soviet domination. You had Marxist communism come in, the Soviet Union took away their democracy, took away their national identity, imposed what was basically Russian supremacy on them, which, quite aggressively was an ideologically atheist dictatorship, so displaced the traditional Catholic, Christian, Orthodox religious values that most of those countries had, and replaced it with Russian Marxist communism. And so people have very bad memories of that. So once you get rid of that, you want to do the opposite. So what is the opposite? It's free market, it's the family unit, it's Christianity, and you're seeing a resurgence of Christianity in a lot of these countries. It's openness to the outside world. And I remember reading the story about one of the early finance ministers of Estonia, which basically has a low-tax, Milton Friedman, monetarist approach to economics. And the way he described it, he said that when he was going to university during the time when Estonia was suppressed by Soviet communism, he said that he learned about these different economists, Marx and Lenin and all these different places, people, and he said the lecturer told him, oh, there's also this other economist called Milton Friedman, but he's very bad and you shouldn't read him. So he said, when he heard that, he thought, oh, I probably should read him. And so he went and read about Milton Friedman and he agreed with it. So when Estonia regained its independence, the Iron Curtain fell, he became the finance minister, he basically implemented textbook Milton Friedman monetarist policies. And that's why Estonia has low flat rates of tax. It has a very free market mentality in its economic policy, and that's why for a country of 1.5 million, it's a minnow on the world stage by any measure. Estonian, small language, not spoken by anyone outside of Estonia, not many people. They've become a really innovative, technologically advanced country. They're probably one of the best countries in the world in terms of digitizing government services. It's the place where Skype was invented. Yeah. I remember going in 2014 and being impressed that everywhere in the city centre there was free Wi-Fi, and that was a deliberate policy because they wanted to be a digitally connected country. And so they bragged about the fact that you could get what's called e-citizenship, which is this ID with a microchip in it, and you plug it into a USB reader with your computer, and the idea is you use that, you access all your government services online, you're meant to be able to set up bank accounts and companies and vote in elections and do everything with sort of electronic, digitized government services. And I guess they went from a very antiquated bureaucratic system. They could skip all the, intermediate steps along the way and be very high tech. So they've done very well out of that. And there's a lot of tech startups now that are based in Tallinn, which is a lovely place to visit. If you haven't been, I'd highly recommend it. So I think it's because they've hit rock bottom. They know that devaluing your traditions, getting rid of the family unit, and having the government take over and be the center of everything is very toxic for the well-being of a society. And so the West has forgotten all that because it's been too good for too long. We won the First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War.
Good times make
weak leaders. Weak leaders make for bad times. Yes. You start that cycle.
I guess so. Now we have a lot of French people that want to move to Eastern Europe to find again some traditional values. That's what's happening. And so, what do you think about the EU elections now? What do you think about Hungary? Should they join the Eurozone? Is there a discussion about getting out of the EU? What do you think about this?
Let me take this in reverse order. So Eurozone first. So Hungary has its own currency, the forint.
Yeah.
A number of other European countries, maintain their own currency. So the Danes, the Swedes, they both have their own version of the Swedish krona, the Danish krona, or in English we would say crown. The Poles have the zloty. There are a couple of others. And I think it's no coincidence. The countries that did best during the Eurozone crisis were those countries that had their own currency. And at that time, of course, the UK was in the EU, so they still had the pound as an EU member, 10 years ago. And I think those countries that stayed out of the euro, they did the right thing, because trying to have monetary union without fiscal union or political union is a recipe for disaster, because it means that implicitly the interest rate is going to be the same if you have a monetary union and a common currency. But you have vastly different economic conditions in different parts of Europe. So the economic fundamentals in Germany and the Netherlands are very different from those in Spain or Italy or Greece. So trying to have a common monetary policy to maintain a common currency becomes very unworkable. And because Germany is the dominant European country, the euro has primarily served their interests. So, the euro is valued at a lower level than what an independent German Deutschmark would be. So it's good if you're a German exporter, because it artificially lowers the price of your exports on the world stage. It makes them more internationally competitive. So they profit tremendously from this. But the countries that lose are the countries that are less sophisticated. So Spain, Greece, Italy, it means their currency for their economic conditions and their standard of living is relatively overvalued. So it's more difficult for them to export. It means that they can't devalue their currency to, rebalance with their levels of public indebtedness. And that's one of the reasons why the growth rates in those countries have been so terrible. It's why the Greeks went through a terrible time 10, 15 years ago, because, their economy was not really at the level, was nowhere near the same level as Germany. So having the same currency and the same monetary policy settings just made no sense. So I don't think Hungary should join the forint. I think they do tremendously well by having their own currency. It means that they're doing much better in attracting international investment, international companies to come in. And it also means that they're less susceptible to domination by Brussels. So based on what's happened, if you have Brussels openly saying, we have a plan to wage war on the Hungarian economy if you don't comply with our political demands, how in any rational world would it make sense for them to join that currency union? It doesn't. So I don't think they will. I don't think Poland or the Swedes or the Danes will either. And I think the Swedes had a referendum a long time ago on whether to join. They said no. The Danes may have too. I don't recall entire 100%, but I think the Swedes definitely voted. They said no, and I think that was the smart thing. So I think really the EU, the euro works if you're Germany. It works if you're the Dutch or the Belgians. It works for the Baltic states as well, probably because they all run, fiscal surpluses. They're all sort of at a fairly high level of economic development. They're fiscally disciplined. Their debt to GDP ratio is not too high, whereas some of the other countries are very different. So being tied into that currency is a problem. Now, other part of your question, will Hungary leave the EU?
Yeah, because this is a question in France.
Um,
But when like the Brexit, but when the Frexit, is
Yeah.
there like Hungary exit?
I don't think it's really on the agenda. I mean, some people have created rumours that they might. I don't see any parties proposing it. Even Fidesz and Viktor Orban say they don't want to. They just think the EU should function in a different way. That's their ideal. So I think their answer would be they want to reform the EU. They want it to stick to its original intentions, and they don't like the way it's mutated into this political dictatorship, centralising decision-making and power in Brussels at the expense of national sovereignty. Now, if there's a point at time in the future where the centralisation gets worse, they might do that. But I think also one of the things that they probably want to wait for as well is for the Hungarian economy to continue to grow and strengthen, because whilst it's in this developing phase, growing very quickly, it still benefits from some EU adjustment funds, and so obviously it's in their interest to continue having that. But if the EU starts to play games with that, as they are with withholding them, and if those become less attractive, then one of the benefits of EU membership is taken away. So I wouldn't say no in the future, but I suspect you're more likely to see an exit from maybe the Dutch, maybe the Danes. I think those are the two countries that are really starting to get fed up, especially with the immigration issue. If Geert Wilders manages to become Prime Minister, which I think we're getting closer and closer, maybe not this term, but the issues are not being resolved in the Netherlands, and that's only going to make him more popular. It seems like there's going to be some kind of dirty deal to stitch him up so he doesn't become PM, even though he's the biggest party by far in the Dutch Parliament. And in the French, I think if the National Rally can get elected, or Reconquête, which I know you're very strongly involved in, Mark, maybe that would change things for France too.
Yeah, there's a discussion, but most mainstream parties like National Rally and Reconquête, they want first to change Europe from within, and they are open to see a Brexit if it doesn't work. But we have some more like radical parties, much smaller, but they want Brexit. They say like, we cannot do anything with the EU. Even if we want to stop low immigration, we cannot because of Brussels. They're imposing something. And also they want to spread the illegal immigrants everywhere in Europe, including Hungary. What is your feeling about Europe in general, not even the EU? Is it becoming like Africa is going to become Muslim? Are you optimistic or pessimistic? Some people, they come to Asia, in Hong Kong, for example, they say, I like France, I like Europe, I love the Western civilization, but I think it's dead. It's better to be here in Hong Kong, and in Hong Kong we live like we're in Europe now. And some other people, they say, no, sooner or later the European people are going to wake up and they're going to do whatever it takes to save Europe. What do you think? What's your guess? Can we still save the European civilization?
I think Eastern Europe is very strong.
Yeah, but for how long?
I think Western Europe very different.
Yes.
So I think the Baltic states, the V4, and some of the non-EU Balkan states, like Serbia, for example. Croatia is in the EU now as well, I think. Are they?
I don't think so.
Well,
there's discussions.
I think that part of the world, I think they're doing quite well because they have a very different value set. I think where the problems in Europe are biggest are in Western Europe. So it's Italy, it's Spain, it's France, it's Germany, Scandinavia. And I think it is because they're drowning under a tremendous amount of debt. The economies are anemic, they're not growing because too much regulation, too much tax.
Yeah.
And more fundamentally, at a cultural and demographic level, they've allowed themselves to be swapped by unregulated, mass illegal immigration. And so that's changing the complexion of society very quickly, and it's become a huge ticking time bomb. I mean, you look at all the pro-Hamas rallies in France, in the UK, in Spain as well. It's just extraordinary.
There's a little bit in Australia as well.
Yeah, you have such large amounts of people promoting what is a neo-Nazi movement. Let's not forget, Hamas is a neo-Nazi movement. They want to wipe Israel off the map. They have this pernicious hatred of the Jewish people. and this exists, and there's seemingly no consequence, no punishment for it, because the police are too scared to arrest any of them, because basically, this demographic, these radicals are, capable of being very violent. So, you have a breakdown in law and order, and that means a breakdown in the quality of civilization. And that's a problem, a big problem. But I wouldn't say it's the biggest problem. I think the biggest problem in Western Europe and in a lot of Western countries is the loss of self-confidence and the loss of self-belief. And it's not a question of illegal immigration, although that is I would say that's a symptom. The original problem is too many, I guess you'd say, local native Western people, people who've been there for generations, centuries. They've lost their compass and their sense of purpose. They don't have any sense of patriotism anymore. They don't have any sense that they have a national tradition that's worth preserving. I guess it makes sense. If you don't believe you have a national tradition worth preserving, you don't care if your culture is swapped and wiped out by something from outside.
In some places in France, you cannot even carry the French flag.
Yeah.
Contrary to even like some places like the US.
And there are probably places in France where you can't speak French anymore, because I assume maybe other languages are more dominant.
It's possible, or maybe you can, but like wearing a French flag, for example, is a symbol of being extremist.
Yeah, it's just ridiculous, isn't it? Yeah, it's just utterly ridiculous. I think, and there's been problems with that in the UK too, where people have been called extremists because they flew the national flag. I mean, it's just absurd. But apparently it's okay to fly Hamas flags or Palestinian flags or all sorts of other countries, but not your own national flag. So I think that's the biggest problem, and the reason it exists is because of this cultural Marxist woke ideology that has infected so many people, and it's being driven by this left-wing agenda in the West, where they're telling you, you have nothing to be proud of in your national tradition, whether you're French or you're Spanish or you're British or you're Australian.
If you're not proud of your identity,
your culture is, imperialist, white supremacist, genocidal, misogynistic. And if this is drummed into you every day by the media, by the schools, by the universities, you're not going to be proud of your country. You're not going to think it's worth fighting for. Why is it the militaries now have problems recruiting people? Well, because the entire point of military recruitment is your country is worth fighting for. Sign up, protect it, and if it's under attack, make the ultimate sacrifice in its defense if you have to. Why would people sign up for that if you think your country, your civilization is not something to be proud of? Why would you care if your language is no longer, the national language and is no longer spoken widely in certain areas? Why would you care if your flag is no longer flown, or your statues are torn down, your history is not taught, if you think it's a bad thing, that's something to be ashamed of? But this has been drilled into people for a long time, and so you probably have an entire generation of people who are totally, they're total strangers to their own history, their own traditions. They haven't been taught it properly. What they have been taught is a very negative slant, and that is why we have these problems.
Yeah.
That I think is the root cause.
Yeah. And you are the opposite, because you discover about some of your roots and you'll go to look for it and go to know more about Hungary.
Yeah, and that's only one part of them. I mean, I have roots in the UK as well. And, I'm very fiercely patriotic about those as well. As an Australian,
Well, you're very patriotic. You have a strong feeling with the Commonwealth as well.
Yes, I do. I think that should be central to your identity. If you're Australian, if you're British, if you're Canadian or New Zealand or from any other Commonwealth country, but especially those, because when you think about what is core to the national identity of an Australian, what is our heritage as an Australian? It's the fact that our mother tongue is the English language. We speak the language of Shakespeare. We govern ourselves under Westminster parliamentary principles as a democracy. Our legal system is based, it traces its antecedents to the rights and freedoms of the Magna Carta and the many centuries of English common law that have developed around that. Our flag is the Southern Cross, the Commonwealth Star, the Union Jack put together, which represents us. We are a federation. We're in the Southern Hemisphere under the Southern Cross, and we are a continuation of the British civilization. That's where most of us, have, part of our ancestry from. It's where our language and our institutions come from. We are a constitutional monarchy under the Crown, which we share with 15 Commonwealth realms. The UK, New Zealand, Jamaica, the Bahamas, Belize, St. Kitts, Tuvalu, all these different countries, we share constitutional monarchy with, which I think is a very, very good system at a practical level, in maintaining stability and democracy, but also because I think monarchy has an important cultural role as a custodian of tradition. And if you want to see that in action, you look at trooping the colour every year for the Queen or the King's birthday. You look at the coronation ceremony. You look at royal weddings, royal
I was there.
funerals. You were there at our function at the FCC.
Yes.
That's a very special experience that you don't get in a republic, and you don't get outside of the system that's based on the British monarchy.
To be fair, I have a lot of friends from France that were kind of jealous of the coronation. I even myself saying, wow, if we had a French king like this, that would be so awesome. But we don't.
I mean, even other countries that do have monarchies, they don't do it the same way. So, for example, Denmark, they crowned a new king and queen recently, but they didn't have, all the ceremony. My understanding is that the Danes haven't done that for more than 100 years. It's a bit more low-key. So to have all these ancient traditions that you go back to sort of 1066 and, all these, very ancient things that are continued to this day. There's value in that.
But for how long?
Well, I hope it continues, forever, because I think there's intrinsic value in those traditions. It says something about who we are and where we've come from, and it gives us meaning. I think if you don't have these traditions, if you take a purely utilitarian view, life is so boring. There's no richness. There's no colour.
I think on this point we totally agree. But I'm not sure so many people in the UK have the same enthusiasm than you. And when you see how the UK is changing, who is the Prime Minister of Scotland, who is the Mayor of London, and recently it was I think it was the National Day of Pakistan, and I saw a Pakistani flag on the Westminster Abbey. I don't know if you've seen this. I feel like in France, many people say the UK is lost. What do you think about it?
I thought that was absurd, and that's one of the problems. Going to the example of the Pakistani flag on Westminster Abbey, for example, that you have Sadiq Khan as the Mayor of London, who is an extreme left-winger, and he's obviously responsible for that, and we can see in all his decisions just dreadful. I think Lee Anderson was absolutely right to criticise him when he says it seems like he wants to appease all these left-wing extremists, all these extreme radical Islamist movements that he seems to appease and very reluctant to condemn.
And one day they might decide to change the tradition for the king and so on.
Even more, I think the even more egregious example is you mentioned the First Minister of Scotland, Hamza Yusuf. It seems he's more like the First Minister of Palestine or Gaza, because all he does about these days, if you read his Twitter feed, if you read his press releases, all he talks about is Gaza and aid for Gaza and how he wants there to be a ceasefire. But he doesn't mention much the fact that Hamas started the war, or that there are 150, Israeli, hostages, many of them young women being raped by these Hamas, terrorists on a daily basis. He doesn't seem to have much sympathy for them. So, it's a concern, definitely, and I hope they both get voted out at the next election. They should never have been put there in the first place. I think one of the problems that left-wing parties face is that the Labour Party's promoted these people because they want to portray themselves as multicultural, and they try and say that their opponents are these bigots and racists and Islamophobes and all these sorts of things.
Same as in France.
Yeah. But I think now they're going to start facing difficulty. They'll have to. I think that coalition is going to be a problem for them because, it might get them some votes, but I've read someone else saying that there's a lot of Indian Christians or Hindus that are actually put off by the Labour Party going too far over one, ethnic minority demographic over another. If you're a Jewish person in the UK, you're going to vote for Hamza Yusuf or Sadiq Khan when they're spewing all this pro-Hamas propaganda? I don't think so. So I think that's a problem for them too.
Yeah. Well, we have the same thing in France. We have a lot of people from Africa who vote for what people say extremist right-wing party because they are fed up with a lot of things. So let's see. I hope there's some changes, with the UK of France and everything, the rest of Europe is not just going to change and become an Islamic union.
That's one of the things I would say about UK Conservative government. Even though I think it's underachieved, in many cases it's been Conservative in name only. It's done very little in its 14 years in office, apart from Brexit.
It doesn't look like Conservative government.
Yeah, all their other policies are not very Conservative. I mean, Lee Anderson, who criticised Sadiq Khan for the reasons we just discussed, they kicked him out for saying those things. Now, if you're kicking someone out for saying those things, how can you call yourself Conservative? It's a joke. But one thing I would say is that they've had a lot of, ethnic minorities in the cabinet. Sajid Javid, who's a Muslim, Priti Patel, who's East African Indian background, same as Rishi Sunak, same as Suella Braverman. There's a lot of examples like that show that this simplistic narrative that the left-wing parties, warm and fuzzy and multicultural, and the conservative right-wing parties, they're only old white people who are actually secretly racist, and nobody who's from an ethnic background would ever vote for them. Actually proved them wrong with that example. So I think that narrative has been dispelled. Although of course the media likes to ignore this and they continue running this simplistic characterization. But now the evidence is very clear. I mean, the first female Prime Minister of the UK, woman, Thatcher. The second female, Theresa May, also a woman. The first non-white person, Rishi Sunak, East African Indian background, also from the Conservative Party.
He's African as well? I thought he was more.
Well, he's Indian, but they were from somewhere in East Africa. I think they were Indians who went to East Africa and they went to the UK.
Okay, I didn't know that. Good. And what about Australia? What do you think about Australia's future? Because you were talking about wokeness and so on in Western Europe, but Australia is known also to be very woke.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah,
but it's quite preserved from illegal immigration because it's far, it's an island. How long?
Think a lot of people overseas are surprised because they think about, Paul Hogan, Crocodile Dundee, throw another shrimp on the barbie. I think Australia's this very relaxed place where people are all sort of larrikins and they speak bluntly and honestly, and it's all sort of that outback culture where people can do what they like. But actually the truth in today's Australia, especially in the cities, it's the total opposite. It's very nanny state. It's very conformist. It's very stifling. And if you don't conform to that woke narrative, people will attack you very viciously. Especially if you're living in the big cities or if you're, in the corporate sector. There's a lot of political, or government sector. There's a lot of political correctness, and all those traditional benefits of Australians being free speaking and so on. Those have all gone. You mentioned, I think, culture and immigration. I think, being far away and surrounded by water, it's more difficult. So we have been very successful in sort of stopping boatloads of people coming in. And even the Labour Party is kind of boxed in and they're forced to continue that policy because even though ideologically they don't like it, they've learned through hard experience that if they move away from it, they'll lose a lot of votes and they'll lose elections. But the actual bigger problem for Australia is legal immigration because the numbers are just ridiculous. I think last year it was more than 500,000 people immigrated through legal channels.
Why? Because the government makes incentives for them to come, or for?
Well, the real reason is that the government and the economic elite want it, and that's because there's no innovation in the Australian economy. GDP per capita is not really growing. There's no productivity growth. So the way for people to continue growing, inverted commas, is to grow gross GDP, and that means expanding the population. So your GDP per capita can be flat, But if you have more population, your gross GDP as an aggregate will still go up. And so that particularly benefits, people like property developers, for example. So it's all about keeping the housing bubble going, because one of the main industries and hobbies of people in Australia is investment property, in inverted commas, although what you really should label the phenomenon is property speculation. People put every cent they have into buying more real estate, more properties, on the basis that, property always goes up. And how do you guarantee property always goes up? Well, you just have huge amounts of immigration, because they all need somewhere to live.
Yeah.
That's why if you go to capital cities especially, you look at the price to buy a home, it's ridiculous. One of the worst housing bubbles in the world. And Australia is such a huge country.
Yeah.
We should not have a housing bubble. We should not have a shortage of housing, but we do.
You don't have a shortage of space, but you have a shortage of house, because so many people come in. Okay.
Yeah, the sheer numbers, the demand is just insane. I mean, there are problems on the supply side too, in terms of regulation and red tape, making the cost of construction is higher than it should be because of all these regulations and taxes. Not enough land is being developed because the planning system is too regulated and too slow. Like, there are other problems too, but the demand side is probably the biggest problem, I would say.
Okay. Well, anyway, we are here, we're talking about Australia, Europe, and everything else. And we also have a conservative club in Hong Kong, and that's how I met you. And I went to Budapest, where I saw a friend I met in Hong Kong before, and he told me about his conservative club, and we had a few events already. Can you tell us more about it, like how it started, where it's going, what we can expect from it, how people can join us, and so on?
Yeah, it's more of an informal network, than anything else. We're not sort of a conventional club in the sense that we're an official organisation or with a building or a constitution. It's sort of more a network of people who know each other, who like coming together because we have common interests, common values, and we just want to sort of talk about the world and have company from like-minded people, which is a very valuable thing to have. And we're very lucky in Hong Kong to have people from so many different parts of the world. I think it came about sort of just by chance. So when I first moved over, I had a couple of friends I knew here to help me set up, and the first person who I rented a spare room from for a couple of weeks, he came from a conservative background in Australia as well, and he introduced me to some other people similar interests from an Australian background. And then over time, as I was here, I met some people with similar interests, but from the UK, and then some from Canada, and then I realised actually it'd be very interesting to sort of bring these people together. And so we started organising, meeting up for drinks or dinner, and along the way, I met yourself, and you've introduced some French people who are of our persuasion. Chaba is a friend of mine, Hungarian, also conservative, and I think it's through him that you found out about us. And so we've been able to have, social outings, drinks, dinner, and so on, and just share ideas and talk about whatever's on our mind.
Okay, let's organize an event soon, another one.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I think we're a friendly crowd, and we like staying in touch. On Signal, we just share, just stay in touch. Share what's going on in each other's lives, and interesting news headlines. From the countries that we come from.
Especially that we have European elections now, so we should talk a little bit about it.
UK election, European election. There
if
are
you
others.
have some conservative, German conservative, Spanish conservative in Hong Kong, we should gather and talk about the election soon. Yeah,
100%.
I'm just thinking about.
Of course, US election in November as well.
As well, oh yeah. Well, we have a busy year actually. There's a lot of things to talk about.
I threw a party for the presidential election 4 years ago. I should probably do the same thing again this time.
What did you? A party. Okay, yeah. Let's do it.
Yeah, we watched the results come in. Yeah,
okay.
It was good fun.
Do you know a lot of Trump supporters in Hong Kong?
There are a few. Yeah.
We should organize something. Yeah. But it makes me think about. I would say one last question. I've heard conservatives generally they have a lot of things in common. They agree about wokeness. They agree about socialism, this and that. Yeah. Free market and so on. But there's one topic I think which dividing conservatives, at least in France, is the war on Russia and Ukraine. What do you think about this?
I think the war in Ukraine, well, no, I think Ukraine is a sovereign country. Its borders were meant to be protected by the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, which Russia signed up to. That was part of the deal where Ukraine surrendered their nuclear weapons. I don't think Russia had good reasons for invading it. So I'm quite supportive, of Ukraine in a moral sense, in terms of, I think they're the innocent party that have been wronged in a lot of ways. There's also an element of realpolitik as well. I think, there's obviously been a sort of border conflict since 2014, and there's sort of a low-level conflict around, Donbass, and also the Russians, they took Crimea in 2014. Now, I think the reality is Crimea is important enough to Russia that they will never let it go. I think if the Ukrainian troops are on the border of Crimea, they probably would threaten to use nuclear weapons to stop Crimea being, retaken by Ukraine. And that's, in some ways, that's unfair on Ukraine. But I mean, the question is, what is the end game here? I mean, I'd like to see Ukraine, go back to the status quo before the war started, but that would mean that part of Donbass would be kept by Russia and they would keep Crimea. And, it's a shame that there hasn't been any deal done around that. I also think it's important that Ukraine is successful as a deterrent to other people, other countries. If you try and just execute a land grab because you think you have the power, the raw military power to do it, that it's not as easy as you think, that there are consequences. But wars are not indefinite. They all have to end some way. And it seems at the moment there's a bit of a stalemate. So I don't know how exactly it ends, but I hope there's a good ending for Ukraine. But they also have to be accountable in terms of what aid they receive, because I don't think there can be unlimited aid from the international community either.
I think that's a big question in the EU elections as well. Like a lot of people, they morally support Ukraine, and especially the Ukrainian people. They don't want people to suffer and so on, but they don't maybe want the French money, the European money to flow more and more to Ukraine, because the European countries need it. But some of the people, they say, no, this is a war in Europe. If Russia gets some part of Ukraine, they're going to move further and further into France maybe one day. So we have to do whatever it takes. Maybe one day we should put European troops in Ukraine. So what do you think? Okay, maybe we should support Ukraine in some way, but how should this work? How far should we go? Do we have to bring more and more money? Do we have to send troops? Do we have to negotiate with Russia? Can we get on the table and talk?
Well, I mean, wars end either through a negotiated outcome or through total absolute victory. But total absolute victory would mean marching all the way to Moscow. I mean, the reality is nobody is going to do that. So the question is, how do you get to the best possible outcome where you make Russia want to agree to some kind of negotiated outcome? And that means you have to be successful on the battlefield so that they feel it's not worth them continuing, or they think that they can't sustain the war themselves. Now, the problem is that quantity has a quality of their own, and Russia has a bigger population and probably a bigger capacity just to throw people at a meat grinder. And because it's not democratic, if lots of Russian troops die, they can sustain that a lot more than Ukraine can politically, or any Western country can. And also, they have a lot more people to sacrifice before the others will run out. So I think we do need to aid the Ukrainians. I think you have to make sure it's done in an effective way. That you sometimes read about how much of the money is actually used on genuinely helping versus siphoned off, and issues with corruption and so on. So you have to deal with those. You also actually have to give them equipment that can make a difference. I think one of the problems, especially in the first year or so, is that there was all this hand-wringing over exactly what to give to Ukraine. So everybody was very supportive in moral terms and in giving money, but they'd say, oh, we'll give you this equipment, but maybe not this, because this type of equipment is too effective and we don't want you to be too successful against Russia, because we're scared that the Russians will escalate and maybe they'll use a tactical nuclear weapon or something like that. I mean, that was a problem with America too. So I think if you're going to support Ukraine in the war, you should actually give them proper support. You should give them, you know, the best weapons you can to fight effectively. And, you know, just giving them old stuff or giving them a little bit but telling them you do this but not that with it. You basically need to give them free rein to fight a war effectively.
So you think they should continue giving some more weapons, but better weapons to make some proper progress?
Yeah. I mean, some of the support given at the beginning was a joke. I remember when the Germans said all they would give was
the old tanks and so
not even old tanks. The first thing they offered was old helmets, but they wouldn't even like ship them directly. They said, "Oh, you have to like come and pick them up from Germany, or we'll go and like deposit them somewhere in Poland, and we'll come and pick them up because we don't want to ship them directly because we don't want to provoke Russia." I mean, it was something just pathetic. I mean, you read that and you think, how can you not do that and not realize that the Russians will see that and think, oh, this is a joke. You're not really being supportive. Like, we just have to be patient and eventually we'll overwhelm
the Russians
them.
As well.
Yeah. I mean, you have to make the Russians take you seriously as well. And that means, you know, acting with force because they understand that language. That's part of Russian culture, that you know, they will react to brute force. And if you're loud and aggressive, even in a social setting, I have a lot of Russian friends and they're great people, but, you know, they react to that sort of thing. It's just part of their psychology.
Okay. And now let's forget about like who attacked who and who is legitimate about the borders and so on. There's a lot of people, at least in France, they don't care about the borders, who started the war and so on. They care about the ideology. And some people in the more leaning towards the Russian, they believe more in the conservatism. They say Western Europe is becoming so woke, it's a decadent place and so on. And the Russians show some kind of traditional conservatism and so on. So they are leaning more towards the Russian because they think they are more conservative. And especially when Europe is becoming more Islamist and so on. And on the other side, some people are more supportive of Ukraine, not because of the reason of the war, but because of they are more European, more white, and also more traditional and so on. Is that? So they want to defend the white people, and they don't want Europe to becoming like African or whatever. And they say Russia is a multi-ethnic society and doesn't work. And you see now, even recently, you have some Islamists killing some people in Moscow and so on. Even though we don't know who like commanded this and so on, but they say the Russian society doesn't work. So we don't want something like Russia. We want Europe to be more white. So that's why they support Ukraine. So what do you think about it? Does it make sense or whatever from both sides? From the moral values.
Yeah, I don't really see it in those terms. I mean, I see Ukraine as generally in the geopolitical interests of Europe and the West. That you know, if Russia swallowed up Ukraine tomorrow, it would mean you have a lot of Russian military capacity right next to Poland, right next to Hungary, right next to Romania, right next to the Baltic states. I don't think that would be a good thing. So it makes sense to have Ukraine as a buffer state. On the cultural and the political stuff, I mean, it is true that in some ways Russian society is socially conservative. I don't think that makes Putin, you know, or his system of government ideal or legitimate in any way. I mean, you don't need to go that far east or to be that authoritarian to have a traditional, you know, sensible, conservative approach to governance. You know, Poland until recently was very good. I think the Baltic states are very good. Hungary is doing very well. Croatia. In some ways, even Austria is not too bad.
So you're saying if you want to be conservative, take more Hungary as an example rather than Russia.
Yeah, well, I think that, or even there's a lot of non-European countries that you can learn from. So there are things we can learn from Armenia. There are things we can learn from Singapore or Japan. You know, there are elements in their society that are very traditional and successful that we can draw from. They're not, you know, they're not European countries, but you know, there are things we can learn from them too, and they have features of their society that are very successful and stable, and I think consistent with that worldview too.
Okay. Do you think Ukraine should be part of the EU?
Should Ukraine be part of the EU? I'm not not sure. I know there's been talk about them joining. I think from the point of view of the Ukrainians, it would probably be a good thing because they'd have access to an enormous amount of funding, from the regional development policy and all the economic adjustment funding that would flow. If you're a European taxpayer, net contributing country, so German, Dutch, Baltic, Scandinavian, maybe French, you might have a different view. Do you want to have that liability? I'm not sure. So I don't know how that debate will play out. I mean, it's clear the EU leaders seem to be quite open to it. I don't know what EU taxpayers would think of it. And the other question is whether or not Ukraine is ready for the obligations of EU membership. Now, I think imposing the euro on Ukraine would be a disaster. Their economy wouldn't sustain it. So you wouldn't be able to do that.
So let's not rush it.
Yeah.
Because some people now want to rush it because they say maybe we don't need Ukraine to meet all the criteria, but we want them to get in the EU first to force a bit Russia to get out of it because Ukraine will be part of kind of NATO and so on. What do you think about NATO? It's working well, it's good?
Well, NATO I think was successful during the Cold War, there's no doubt about that. I think as a security community today, in theory, I think it has a very respectable purpose. The idea of collective defence, that should have, as a matter of theory, a deterrent effect and make it less likely anybody will attack you. And the proof is in the pudding. Nobody has really attacked a NATO country over the last however many years.
Yeah, so for sure it's working.
Yeah. So it works in that sense, but the member states have to live up to their obligations. And one of the problems is that almost all of them free ride off the US because not many of them actually fulfill their obligation to contribute to their own defence, to spend at least 2% of GDP on their own military. I don't think France does that. I don't think the Germans have been doing that. I think apart from the US, the only countries that really do are Poland, the 3 Baltic countries. I think the Greeks do, although they kind of fudge the figures and count military pensions in the 2%, which is not great because it's not really part of your active military capacity. But you really need people to pay their fair share. Like, I think President Trump raised a legitimate point when he said a lot of European countries are not pulling their weight, and they really should. And if you're a US taxpayer, the US is pulling its weight. They're the biggest military spender, they're the biggest military power. They provide all the firepower to make sure the defense guarantees work and can be enforced, but they need help. I think Europe has to do more because other countries are becoming more militarily powerful. Russia has modernized their military, China is modernizing, a lot of different countries that are not in NATO. India's become a lot more powerful too. Pakistan has a fairly powerful military. So America can't do it on its own, and with its level of indebtedness, they need to be much more careful economically and financially. So I think Europe is obligated to, and it really should, as a matter of their own sovereignty and their own pride and self-esteem. You should have your own defense capacity.
Do you think Ukraine should be part of NATO?
Well, I think that would be provocative. I mean, that's one of the alleged reasons for the war is that the Russians didn't want them to join NATO. But in a way, now that they are at war, like, the threat has kind of fallen away, but at the same time, if they join NATO today, that means everybody's obliged to send military forces to Ukraine. And that means everybody's at war with Russia.
Do you want this?
I would rather not have a war with Russia if it can be avoided. Now, maybe there's no choice geopolitically. Maybe it's inevitable, but I suspect it's not. I suspect if we armed the Ukrainians properly and seriously, that they would be able to do enough themselves on the battlefield that they'd be able to force the Russians to negotiating. I think that should be the primary strategy. Now, if that has problems, I think if the Russians were sort of near Lviv and near the Polish border and swallowing up Ukraine entirely, then I think you probably would have to consider some kind of deployment or support to stop that happening. Because I don't think that would be in anybody's interest. It would be a massive loss of prestige, especially now that we've said that we want to preserve the integrity of Ukraine. If we don't actually do it, it's a huge humiliation. It would kind of show that NATO and the West is impotent, and it would embolden everybody else to be much more provocative, because it would suggest, oh, so America can't enforce red lines, and the Germans are useless, and all the other Western powers are useless. So I think we're in a position where we have to enforce it.
Okay, it's fine. Well, I'm happy about this discussion. Would you like to add anything?
I think it's been pretty wide-ranging. It's been a lot of fun, and I hope we can do more sometime.
Yeah. Well, let's do again one more in a few months after the next upcoming conservative dinner or whatever, or at the conservative dinner. That would be interesting. Thanks a lot, Nicholas.
Look forward to it, Mark.
Very interesting.
Pleasure. All right.
A pleasure.